The Threatened Legacy. The old Ford pickup truck, a rusty monument to a life lived in service of the land, rumbled down the dirt road, kicking up a plume of golden dust that hung in the late afternoon sun. Jack, his knuckles gnarled like the oak trees on his property, gripped the worn steering wheel. Every pothole, every bump was a familiar tremor, a reminder that this land, this rhythm, was in his blood. He was the last of the line, a solitary sentinel guarding a 150-acre farm that had belonged to his family for 4 generations. The farm wasn't a showpiece. The barn leaned a little to the right, the paint peeling in long, faded strips. The fences were a patchwork of new wood and old wire. But to Jack, it was a masterpiece. The air smelled of fresh hay, damp earth, and something uniquely his, a blend of hard work and quiet solitude. He'd come back here after his wife passed, seeking refuge from the sterile sadness of the city, and found it in the slow, honest toil of the soil. Here, his grief had a purpose. He could bury it in the fields and watch new life grow. Today, however, a foreign object sullied his view, a sleek black Cadillac Escalade parked at the end of his driveway. It was a city car, a predator in his peaceful world, a man in an expensive suit, a perfect caricature of everything Jack despised, was standing by the gate. He was young, clean-shaven, and carried a folder that looked too pristine to be anything but bad news. Frank Harrison. The name was a stain on the local papers, a shadow cast over the community. He was the kind of man who saw a centuries-old oak as lumber and a family farm as a subdivision. Jack killed the engine and the silence of the afternoon rushed in. He got out slowly, the groan of the truck door echoing in the stillness. "Mr. Harrison," Jack said, his voice a low gravel, devoid of any warmth. He didn't offer a handshake. Frank's smile was as practiced and unnatural as a politician's. "Mr. Dawson, thanks for seeing me again. I just wanted to bring you our final offer on that." He pointed to the field stretching toward the horizon. "That's not just land. It's what fed my grandpa. It's where my wife and I planted our first garden. It's where I buried my dog. You can't put a price on a memory." Frank's face tightened. The pretense of pleasantry was gone. "Look, I've been patient. My partners are getting antsy. This is the last time. Take the money, Mr. Dawson. Don't make this difficult." "It's already difficult for you," Jack retorted, his voice steel, "because this land isn't for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Now get your fancy car off my driveway before I have to pull my old truck up and scrape it off myself." Frank's jaw clenched. He stuffed the folder back into his briefcase with a sharp snap. "You'll regret this, Dawson," he muttered, the words dripping with a cold, corporate threat. "Everyone has a price. Some just don't know it yet." Jack watched the black Escalade disappear in a cloud of dust. The silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It was tainted. A chill wind, not from the weather, but from the shadow of a coming storm, snaked through the air. He stood there for a long time, looking at the land he loved, knowing it was now marked. He had won the battle, but the war, he realized with a heavy heart, had just begun. He walked toward his house, the ache in his bones a grim prelude to the fight to come. The blazing sin. The moon, a sliver of cold bone in the vast, starless sky, offered no light. The world was a canvas of deep black and deeper shadows. Jack was a ghost in his own house, his sleep a restless, fitful thing born of age and worry. A strange crackle, like dry leaves scuttling across a field, pulled him from his slumber. It was a sound that didn't belong to the night. He lifted his head, his senses on high alert, honed by a lifetime spent listening to the land's whispers. And then came the smell, the acrid, biting scent of gasoline, followed by the undeniable, terrifying perfume of smoke. Jack bolted upright, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He extinguished the proof of the crime. He watched, a spectator to his own tragedy, as a lifetime of memories turned to ash. He was an observer to his own destruction. But as the fire dwindled to a furious red glow, a new thought took root in his mind. A dangerous, brilliant idea. He walked back into the house, his steps slow and deliberate. The smell of smoke clung to his clothes and hair. He felt nothing. An eerie calm settling over him like a shroud. He moved methodically, almost robotically. He gathered his wallet, a few $100s, and the worn leather wallet of his wife. He grabbed a small waterproof case and stuffed it with a few old photos of his family. His father on the tractor, his wife in the garden. A younger, happier Jack. Finally, he grabbed a beat-up, wide-brimmed cowboy hat, the one he wore every day. It had a grease stain on the front, a faded symbol of his honest work. As the first tendrils of dawn stretched across the sky, he walked out to the truck. He didn't look back at the smoldering ruins. He drove it to the edge of his property, where the dirt road met the forest. He pulled out a jerry can of gasoline, doused the inside of the truck, and lit a match. The truck, his last remaining sentinel, burst into flames. He stood for a moment, watching it burn. An almost detached observer of his own demise. He then took his favorite cowboy hat and carefully placed it on the dashboard. A final, dramatic flourish. It was his last and final goodbye to the life he once had. He then slipped into the dense, tangled undergrowth of the forest, becoming a shadow among the trees. Jack Dawson, the man who had loved his land, was dead. Frank Harrison, meanwhile, was sipping a celebratory scotch in his high-rise apartment, looking at the city lights. He had just received a text from his man. "It's done. He's gone." Frank smiled, raising his glass in the silent toast. "No loose ends," he murmured to himself, watching the distant glow of a fire truck racing toward the countryside. Just a new beginning. He didn't realize he had just opened the doors to a different kind of hell. A man who was supposed to be a corpse was coming back to life. Jack didn't live like a man. He lived like a creature of the wild. He moved with a silent purpose, his every action a testament to a lifetime of observing the natural world. He had built a crude but effective lean-to, a fortress of branches and leaves hidden by a thicket of pine trees. He lived on foraged berries and roots, and the small game he trapped with snares he had learned to make as a boy. His hands, once calloused from honest work, were now scarred with the new marks of survival. His face, once open and weathered, was now gaunt and shadowed, a mirror of the ghost he had become. He shaved his scruffy beard with an old hunting knife and cut his long, unkempt hair. The man in the mirror was no longer Jack Dawson, the kind-hearted farmer. He was just Jack, an unknown entity, a phantom in the forest, a ghost haunting the very land he refused to give up. The unheard whispers. The site of the future Heritage Hills Golf Resort was a beehive of activity. Bulldozers, backhoes, and dump trucks tore at the earth, ripping up the fields that Jack had toiled in for decades. Frank Harrison, in his pristine hard hat and tailored jacket, stood on a makeshift platform, a triumphant general surveying his conquered territory. He had bought out a small local construction company, believing that keeping the operation in-house would make everything go faster. He was wrong. The first incident was dismissed as a fluke. A brand new bulldozer, its hydraulics hissing, suddenly refused to move. The crew chief, a man named Dave with a perpetual frown, swore the lines had been tampered with. The mechanics found a minuscule, almost invisible cut, too clean to be an accident, too precise to be vandalism. Frank scoffed. "A bad part," he declared, his voice full of corporate certainty. "Replace it and get back to work. But the incidents became a pattern. A week later, a crane safety lock failed, causing a loud, terrifying shudder that nearly toppled its load. A day after that, the tires on 3 dump trucks were found flat, the punctures so tiny they were barely noticeable. The disruptions were small, never causing serious injury, but they were like 1,000 tiny needles, pricking at the project's efficiency and Frank's composure. Moved through the darkness like a whisper, leaving no footprints, no broken branches. One night, he crept up to the edge of the camp. He watched the men sleep in their trailers, their world so fragile, so temporary. He felt a deep, almost spiritual connection to the land that Frank and his men were desecrating. It wasn't just a piece of property anymore. It was a living thing, and it was crying out in pain. Jack was its hand of retribution. He unscrewed the caps on the gas tanks of the generators. He didn't drain the fuel. He added a small amount of sugar, enough to gum up the engines and cause a complete system failure in a few days. He then returned to his hidden camp, a silent specter in the shadows. He ate a small meal of wild berries and felt a cold satisfaction. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't a thief. He was something far more terrifying to a man like Frank Harrison. He was an unseen force. He was the whisper that no one was meant to hear. He was the slow, methodical grinding of the gears of revenge, a process as patient and relentless as the earth itself. The breach and the mark. The site manager, a perpetually stressed man named Greg, was on the phone with Frank Harrison. His voice was a thin wire of frayed nerves. "Mr. Harrison, I'm telling you, it's not a coincidence anymore. We've had a dozen equipment failures this week alone. It's not just a ghost, it's someone sabotaging the site. We're losing money by the hour, and the men are scared." Frank, from the comfort of his glass-walled office, dismissed him with a sigh. "Greg, get a grip. It's a few hiccups. Tighten up security. Do a better job. I've got more important things to deal with." He was lying. The project delays were infuriating, a constant nagging drain on his bottom line. The idea of some vengeful farmer haunting the woods was ridiculous, but the thought of a living man with a grudge made his skin crawl. Jack, meanwhile, was ready to take the next step. The small, isolated attacks on the construction equipment in the back, a careless oversight by a maid or a son. He slid through, moving through the opulent darkness like a shadow. He didn't want money or valuables. That would be too easy, too predictable. He wanted to leave a message, a mark, a whisper in the dark. He walked past the expensive furniture and the modern art. He found Frank's office, a sterile space filled with glowing computer screens and stacks of legal documents. He went to the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. From the pocket of his worn jacket, he pulled out a small, dried piece of wood. It was from the old rocking chair on his porch, a piece that had survived the fire. He laid it gently on a stack of neatly filed contracts. It was a single piece of dead wood on a mountain of paper, an echo of the life that Frank had destroyed. He then moved to the bedroom. Frank and his wife, a beautiful woman named Eleanor, were fast asleep. Jack stood there for a moment, just watching them. He saw the cold, detached look on Frank's sleeping face and felt a surge of cold fury. He didn't touch anything, didn't make a sound. Instead, he took the last item from his pocket, a single grimy, dirt-stained button from his favorite jacket, the one he had been wearing the night of the fire. He carefully placed it on Frank's nightstand, right next to his wallet. It was a tangible piece of the man Frank had killed. Jack slipped back out into the night, the rain washing away his tracks. He was no longer a ghost in the woods. He was a ghost in the machine, a personal, silent threat. The next morning, Frank found the button. He didn't understand what it was at first, just a dirty button. He was about to toss it when a cold dread washed over him. The stain on the button, a smear of mud and ash, looked disturbingly familiar. He rushed to his office and saw the piece of wood on his desk, a tiny, silent splinter from a dead man's life. The blood drained from his face. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a ghost. It was someone, and that someone had been in his house, in his bedroom. The fear was a living thing, a viper coiling in his stomach. He wasn't just losing money. He was losing his sense of safety, his control. The predator had become the prey. The family fracture. Frank's paranoia, property, but in his home. Frank had a new target. Frank's marriage to Eleanor. Eleanor was a woman of pristine elegance, a socialite who seemed to float through life, untouched by the kind of grime and struggle that defined Jack's existence. But Jack, in his time living as a shadow, had learned to watch. He saw the coldness in her eyes when she looked at Frank, the way she flinched when he raised his voice. He knew she wasn't truly happy, and that was his in. He started with small things, subtle manipulations that would sow seeds of doubt. He used a stolen phone to send an anonymous text to Eleanor, a single cryptic message. Ask him about his trip to Denver and the redhead. There was no redhead, there was no trip to Denver, but the accusation was enough. Eleanor, already suspicious of Frank's long hours and erratic behavior, confronted him. Frank, already on edge, snapped at her. The argument was a sharp, bitter exchange that ended with Eleanor retreating to the guest room, their perfect marriage showing its first real crack. Jack then escalated his game. He found a piece of Frank's old correspondence, a letter from a business trip. He doctored a small part of it, changing the date to make it look like Frank had a secret rendezvous. He then slipped the letter, along with an old, cheap motel key, into Eleanor's purse when she was at a charity luncheon. When Eleanor found them, a cold dread filled her. The carefully manicured facade of her life was starting to crumble. The final blow came in the form of a package. Jack had used a P.O. box and a false name to send it to Eleanor. Inside was a single, expensive-looking photograph. It was a picture of Frank shaking hands with the judge who presided over Jack's property auction. There was nothing incriminating in the photo itself, but Jack had included a handwritten note on the back, mimicking a business associate's scrawl. It read, "Thanks again for the favor. The judge was a great sport. He really pulled through for us." Eleanor didn't need to know the details. She didn't need to know about the land, the fire, or the dead farmer. All she needed to see was the insinuation, the suggestion that her husband was a fortress of steel and glass was now bleeding cash from every quarter. The Heritage Hills project was a ghost town of idle machinery, its silence a constant, mocking reminder of his failure. But the financial losses, the failing marriage, and the loss of social standing, all of it paled in comparison to the fear. The fear was a living thing, a presence in his home and at his office. The small, dirty button on his nightstand had a name, Jack Dawson. He had to find him. He couldn't go to the police. What could he say? A dead man is sabotaging my business and ruining my life? They'd have him committed. Instead, Frank went to the only people who dealt in a world beyond the law, a private investigation firm run by a former Special Forces operator. The man, a cold-eyed professional named Marcus, listened to Frank's frantic, rambling story without a single change in expression. "You're telling me a dead farmer is doing all this?" Marcus asked, his voice flat. Frank leaned forward, his hands trembling. "He's not dead. He faked his death. I know it. He's out there. He's a ghost in the machine. He's playing with me." Marcus saw the desperation in Frank's eyes, and that was all the confirmation he needed. He took the job. He assembled a small team, a group of specialists who operated in the shadows. They didn't rely on police reports or public records. They relied on instinct and their own brutal brand of logic. They were hunters, and Frank's fear was the scent they were following. The hunt began in the charred ruins of Jack's farm. Marcus and his team meticulously combed through the site, not for clues of arson, but for signs of a man's survival. They found traces of Jack's existence, a fire pit in the woods, the remains of small game he'd cooked, and faint, almost erased footprints. The trail was cold, but it was there. Jack was not just a survivor, he was a master of his domain. He had vanished into the landscape, a phantom in the trees, a part of the very earth Frank had tried to conquer. Jack, watching from a distance, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The hunters were here. He was no longer the unseen predator. He was the prey. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless. He began to set traps, not to injure, but to mislead and disorient. He let the team, spooked and unnerved, retreated. They had found their quarry, but he wasn't a man. He was a force of nature. Frank's phone rang. It was Marcus. "We found him," Marcus said, his voice grim. "But he's not what you think. He's not a man anymore. He's part of the woods. This isn't a job for us, Frank. He's not after money or revenge. He's after you." Frank hung up, his hands shaking. He had unleashed a monster, and now the monster was coming for him. The hunt was over. The game had just begun. The economic cripple, Frank Harrison, had retreated into his fortress. He was no longer a conqueror, but a man under siege. The construction project, his crown jewel, was at a standstill. The sabotage continued, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, methodical precision of a master craftsman. The new generators he bought failed within days, their fuel lines mysteriously clogged. The expensive security cameras he installed captured nothing but shadows and the rustling of leaves. Even Vince, his hulking bodyguard, was jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder at the empty woods. But Jack's greatest weapon was not the sabotaged equipment. It was the law. Frank had built his empire on a foundation of cutting corners and bending rules. He had relied on local corruption and quiet payoffs. He had always been so careful to leave no paper trail, to make every transaction look clean. He never counted on a ghost with a laptop. Jack, with his new identity and his knowledge of the land, had spent weeks at a public library in a neighboring town. He had learned how to navigate the murky world of public records and environmental regulations. He found a loophole, a small, obscure piece of legislation from the early 1900s that protected specific migratory bird nesting grounds. He discovered that the wetlands on Frank's newly acquired land were a sanctuary for a rare, endangered species of owl. Frank's team, in their hurry to clear the land, had not done a proper environmental impact study. Jack didn't go to the local authorities. He knew they were in Frank's pocket. He went to a national environmental watchdog group, a powerful and well-funded organization that prided itself on bringing down corporate giants. He sent the nightmare was even worse. News vans from national networks descended on the small town, with journalists asking pointed questions about corporate greed and endangered wildlife. Frank's face, once a symbol of wealth and success, was now plastered on every screen, a smug caricature of a man who cared more about money than the environment. His wife, Eleanor, watching the news from her lawyer's office, felt a cold sense of vindication. The truth, in its own way, was coming out. Frank was not just a liar and a cheater. He was a destroyer, a man who would burn a forest and kill a man just to get what he wanted. Frank, standing on his lawn, watched the news crew from his living room window. He had paid off the local press, but he couldn't stop the national media. He looked out at the empty woods, the silent trees, and felt a cold hand on his throat. He had won the war, but he was losing everything he had fought for, and he knew with a terrible, icy certainty that the man who had done this was still out there. Jack Dawson had returned from the dead, not with a shotgun, but with a vengeance far more lethal: the truth. The psychological trap. Frank's world was a cage of his own making. The walls were his house, the bars were the constant presence of his bodyguard Vince, and the lock was his own escalating paranoia. He had become a prisoner of his own success, The construction site was a battlefield he no longer dared to visit, and his once unflappable composure was gone, replaced by a twitchy, fearful demeanor. He couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside was Jack. He was losing his grip on reality. He started seeing Jack's face in the crowds, in the shadows, even in the reflection of his office window. He would jump at the slightest sound, screaming at his staff and his lawyers, convinced they were conspiring against him. Eleanor had already moved out, taking their son Adam with her. The house, once filled with the muted sounds of a family life, was now a tomb of silence and fear. Jack knew it was time for the final, most devastating blow. He wasn't after money or property anymore. He was after Frank's soul. He had studied Frank's routine for months. He knew that every Saturday morning, "Your dad sent me. He wants to show you something." Adam, trusting and naive, followed him. Jack led him into the forest, not toward his hidden camp, but to a small, secluded cave he had discovered. It was a dark, damp place, hidden by a curtain of vines. He gave Adam a granola bar and a bottle of water. "Stay here," Jack said. "Your dad will be here soon." Adam, confused but not yet afraid, sat down, still clutching his phone. Jack took the phone and turned it off. Then Jack made the phone call. He called Frank's cell, not with his own voice, but with a pre-recorded message from a voice changer he had made. The message was short and chilling. "You know what it feels like now, Frank. The feeling of losing everything. I didn't take your son for ransom. I took him to show you what it feels like to lose what you can't replace. He's at the old cave in the woods. I'm waiting for you." Frank's world shattered. The fear, the paranoia, the mounting losses, they all coalesced into a single agonizing point. His son was gone. He looked at Vince, his hulking bodyguard, and saw nothing but a useless slab of meat. He ran out of his office, his mind in a feverish frenzy. He didn't call the police. He didn't call anyone. This wasn't a crime. It was a war, and he had to face his enemy alone. He ran toward the woods, his fancy shoes slipping on the wet ground, his suit jacket getting caught on every low-hanging branch. He wasn't a corporate titan anymore. He was a desperate man hunting a ghost. A father trying to save his son. The game was over. The trap had been sprung. The moment of confrontation. The woods, once a silent sanctuary, now echoed with the frantic sounds of Frank's desperation. He stumbled through the undergrowth, his tailored suit ripped, his hands and face scratched by thorns and branches. He was a man out of his element, a predator who had wandered into a different kind of jungle. He had left his phone behind, his mind a feverish blur of a cornered beast. Jack didn't move. He stood there, a silent sentinel, his hands empty, his expression calm. He was an immovable object, a monument to the life Frank had burned to the ground. Frank tackled him, a clumsy, pathetic attempt at violence. He landed a punch, but Jack didn't even flinch. He simply caught Frank's arms, his grip surprisingly strong, and held him in a vice-like grip. "What do you want, you psycho?" Frank spat, tears of frustration and rage running down his face. "Money? A house? I'll give you everything. Just tell me where my son is." Jack's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, chilling whisper. "I don't want your money, Frank. I don't want a new house. I want you to feel it, the way I felt it, the night you took everything from me." He released Frank, who stumbled back, a bewildered look on his face. Jack walked slowly toward a large, moss-covered rock and sat down. He pulled a small, sleek object from his pocket, a digital audio recorder. The red light was on, a tiny glowing eye in the gathering darkness. "I didn't take him for ransom," Jack said, his voice calm and steady. "I took him to give you a moment of clarity, to show you what it feels like to lose what you can't replace. I want you to say it, Frank. I want you to tell me what you did." Frank laughed, a high, manic sound. "What I did? I burned your worthless farm. I took a piece of dirt that you were too stupid to let go of. I would do it again and again and again." The words poured out of him, a torrent of guilt and rage, his voice a frantic confession. "That's what you want, isn't it? The truth. There it is. Now where is my son?" Jack stood up and walked toward the cave. He pulled aside the curtain of vines and gestured inside. "He's fine, Frank. He's sleeping. He's safe." He looked at Frank with eyes that were no longer vengeful, but filled with a deep, sorrowful pity. "I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted you to know what it feels like." Frank's rage evaporated, replaced by a cold they recognized from the missing persons report. The local sheriff, a grizzled man who had known Jack for years, looked at Frank with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Frank Harrison? What the hell happened here?" he demanded. Frank couldn't speak. He just pointed a trembling finger at Jack. "He's alive. He faked his death. His voice trailed off, his carefully constructed lies crumbling in his throat. Jack didn't defend himself. He simply bent down, picked up the audio recorder, and handed it to the sheriff. "It's all on there," he said, his voice flat. "Everything you need to know." The sheriff, skeptical but intrigued, took the device. While his deputies searched the cave and found a terrified but unharmed Adam, he pressed play. Frank's frantic confession, his voice filled with rage and pride, filled the quiet clearing. The sheriff's eyes widened. He had heard whispers, of course, but he had never imagined the truth was so brutal, so simple. Frank had hired an arsonist. He had destroyed Jack's life. They led Frank away in handcuffs. He didn't resist. He was a shell of a man, defeated not by brute force, but by the relentless, methodical vengeance of a ghost. As he was led past Jack, he looked him in the eye, and for the first time, Jack saw not hatred, but a deep, haunting emptiness. Frank had lost his business, his wife, and now his freedom. But more than that, he had lost his very soul. Jack watched the flashing red and blue lights disappear into the night. His revenge was complete. He had gotten what he wanted. He had exposed Frank for the monster he was. But there was no sense of triumph. The fire that had burned his farm had also burned away a part of him. He felt hollow, an empty vessel filled with the silence of the woods. He had lost everything, and now, even in victory, he felt no joy. He looked down at the empty plot of land where his farm once plot. The house was gone. The barn was gone. The memories were still there, but they were now tainted by ash and betrayal. He decided not to rebuild, not in the same place. He knew he could never be a farmer again. That life was over. The man who had walked out of the fire was not the same man who had walked into it. The ghost in the woods had no place in a world of tractors and planting seasons. Instead, Jack bought a small, humble piece of land in a different town, miles away from the chaos and the ghosts of his past. It was a simple plot with a small, unpretentious house. The land was not as rich, the soil not as black, but it was his. He didn't buy a tractor or a plow. He bought tools for a different kind of work. He spent his days in the garden, not with the intention of growing food, but with the intention of growing peace. He planted flowers, not for profit but for beauty. He planted trees not for lumber but for shade. He built a fence, not to keep people out, but to create a small, quiet world of his own. One afternoon, as the sun set, he sat on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. He was no longer a ghost, no longer a vengeful specter. He was just a man. He watched the light fade from the sky, a quiet sense of peace finally settling into his bones. He had lost a home, a wife, and a life, but he had found something else. He had found a new purpose. He got up and walked to the back of the garden. He looked at the small, sturdy sapling he had planted just a few weeks ago. It was a small tree, but it was a beginning. He reached down and ran his fingers over the soil, feeling the cool, soft earth. It was a different kind of ground, but it was a promise. He had avenged his past, but now he was finally ready to start a new future. The old farm was a memory. The new one was a home